October 1943, Mühlhausen, Bavaria. The first light of dawn bled through a veil of fog, spilling across the cobblestones of the village square. Frost clung to the window panes of shuttered homes, and the air carried that hollow stillness that only comes before another day of war. Then, from the distance, came the faint rhythm of boots, the sound of captivity marching. Work Detail Number 47 emerged from the morning mist, a column of British prisoners of war, gaunt and weary, their uniforms patched with mud and frost. They marched 2 by 2, guarded by boys in field gray, young men hardly older than the soldiers they escorted. The villagers barely looked up anymore. This was routine now. Another day, another forced labor shift in the frozen fields outside town. But that morning, something different happened. As the column passed through the square, a few small figures appeared at the edges of the street. 2 children at first, barefoot, still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Then 5, then a dozen. They began to follow, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, matching the pace of the prisoners. Their voices whispered and giggled in the cold, little clouds of breath rising into the pale air. An 8-year-old boy, with hair like straw and cheeks red from wind, tugged timidly at the sleeve of a young German guard. "Peter, Herr Feldwebel," he asked in a small voice, "can the Englishman teach us again today?" The guard hesitated. He couldn't meet the boy's eyes. Orders had come down weeks ago. No more contact with the prisoners. No talking. No teaching. But this guard, barely 19, had a younger brother among those same children. He looked down the line at the British sergeant who walked near the front, a man with kind eyes and a face worn by both hunger and quiet dignity. 10 minutes. The guard muttered finally during the midday break. 10 minutes only. Flight Sergeant James Morrison had once been a mathematics teacher in Leeds, a man who spent his days at a chalkboard explaining angles and equations to children who complained about rain and homework. Then came the war. His Lancaster bomber was shot down over Hamburg the previous winter. Now he wore a torn uniform and carried a wooden shovel instead of a textbook. But that afternoon, for 10 fleeting minutes inside a drafty German barn, he became a teacher again. The children crowded around him, thin, pale faces illuminated by shafts of sunlight breaking through the wooden slats. Morrison knelt in the dirt, took a stick, and began to draw circles, triangles, simple shapes, geometry that transcended language. The little ones leaned closer, eyes wide with wonder, whispering answers in German while he smiled faintly, nodding. For those few minutes, the war fell away. The guards pretended not to watch, but even they lingered near the doorway. These children didn't see an enemy. They saw the first teacher they'd had in nearly 2 years. Their fathers had gone east, to Stalingrad, to the endless winter, to graves with no markers. Their mothers worked long hours in fields and factories. The schools stood empty, their windows broken, their chalkboards coated in dust. And now, in the heart of occupied Bavaria, a captured Englishman was drawing hope in the dirt. Outside, the bells tolled noon. The moment ended. The guard cleared his throat. The men stood. The children scattered like sparrows, clutching invisible lessons in their small hands. By 1943, rural Germany was bleeding teachers. Every man between 18 and 45 had been conscripted into Hitler's war machine. Those left behind were too old, too sick, or too broken to teach. Some villages hadn't seen a single teacher in 18 months. Entire generations grew up without learning to read or write. Children who had begun school in 1939 could barely spell their own names by 1943. In that silent gap of learning and loss, Morrison's 10-minute lessons became legend, whispered among children, tolerated by guards, unknown to the world beyond the barbed wire. It was the smallest act of rebellion, and yet in a place built on cruelty, it was also an act of grace. The British prisoners arrived in small German villages scattered across Saxony, sent not to factories or quarries, but to farms. Their new labor was agricultural, harvesting potatoes, repairing barns, plowing frozen fields under the gray German sky. They were officers and NCOs, men technically protected by the Geneva Convention from forced manual labor. But the rules of war had long begun to blur. The Germans, desperate for manpower to keep their rural economy alive, quietly ignored the convention in exchange for the food these men could help grow. Yet what the Germans could not have predicted was who these prisoners really were before the war began. Among the men in tattered uniforms and muddy boots were Cambridge graduates, Oxford scholars, engineers, schoolmasters, clerks, and Sunday school teachers. Men who had spent their lives shaping young minds, now reduced to turning soil with blistered hands. But their knowledge, their ability to teach, had not been taken from them. It began in a village called Holthof, a cluster of slate-roofed houses nestled between pale fields and the dark line of the forest. Barely 400 people lived there. The war had stolen its sons and its teachers alike, leaving behind women, the elderly, and children with empty schoolrooms. Into that silence came a group of weary British prisoners, escorted by guards who had long since grown indifferent to cruelty. Among them was Flying Officer William Clark, a quiet, sharp-eyed man who had studied literature at Cambridge before the RAF. One afternoon, while repairing a barn wall, Clark noticed a small group of children standing at the edge of the field, watching him. Their faces were thin, their clothes patched and worn, but their eyes were curious, drawn by the strange rhythm of his speech, the unfamiliar music of English words passed between prisoners. During a short water break, Clark dipped his finger into the dust on the barn wall and traced a letter, an A, then a B, then a C. The children stared, whispering among themselves. One girl, perhaps 10 years old, stepped forward hesitantly and pointed at the letters, then at her chest, silently asking a question. Clark smiled faintly, understanding. He knelt and wrote her name beneath the alphabet. Anna. She gasped, her eyes widening as though he had conjured magic from the air. Then, like birds finding courage, the other children crowded closer, each demanding their own names in the strange foreign letters. The prisoners, exhausted from their work, paused to watch. Even the German guard, leaning against a fence with his rifle slung low, did not intervene. He was an old man, his back bent but his eyes soft. Before the First War, he had been a schoolteacher himself, now too old for combat, but still strong enough to watch over captured airmen. As he watched Clark carefully draw each name, he saw something stirring that had been absent from this village for years. The hum of learning, the quiet spark of hope. His own grandchildren were among the group, laughing, repeating sounds they had never heard before. What began as a few words scrawled in dust became a ritual. 10 minutes. That was the unofficial allowance the guards gave each afternoon. 10 minutes that soon carried the weight of something extraordinary. Within days, word spread through the prisoner work details, from Holthof to the next village, and the next. Children began to gather wherever the British were sent. They came barefoot through the mud, clutching scraps of paper or bits of chalk stolen from old classrooms. And the men, their spirits lifted by this small act of defiance, began to teach. Not propaganda, not the language of war. Real lessons. Arithmetic, geography, the shape of the world as it once was, drawn in the dirt. In those fragile minutes between labor and darkness, something impossible was happening. Prisoners and children, enemies by decree, had built a small wordless truce, bound not by orders, but by the human hunger to learn. Reading, writing, even simple English phrases, these things had become dangerous acts. The guards stationed at the work farms faced an impossible situation. Orders from Berlin were absolute. No fraternization between prisoners and civilians. No exceptions, no kindness, no contact, especially with children. But those orders were written far away, by men who had never looked into the faces of the people they ruled. Here, in the small villages of Saxony, the war had grown thin and tired. The guards lived among the same families they were told to police. They shared food shortages, the same harsh winters, the same nightly air raid sirens. Their own children sat in the same empty classrooms. Their wives whispered the same prayers in candlelight. Among those guards was Sergeant Major Thomas Hartley, a British prisoner captured at Dunkirk. Before the war, he had been a mathematics instructor at a grammar school in Birmingham. A man of structure and patience, his hands more accustomed to chalk than to chains. Now, assigned to forced agricultural labor near the town of Waldheim, he tilled the fields by day and slept on straw at night, watched by men scarcely older than his students had once been. It was during those long evenings that he noticed something peculiar. The farmer's 3 children, pale, shy, and underfed, could barely add numbers together. When they helped him count bushels of grain or measure seed, they stumbled through the simplest sums. Their mother, Frau Müller, watched in quiet humiliation. Her husband had been killed at Stalingrad. Her days were spent fighting to keep the small farm alive, her nights worrying that her children's futures were slipping away into the mud of war. One evening, as the last light fell across the yard, she approached Hartley. Her German was rapid and anxious. His was limited, broken by the exhaustion of years in captivity. Finally, she switched to halting English learned from a battered dictionary. "Please," she said, gesturing toward her children inside the doorway, "you teach. My children, they must learn. After war, they need, how you say, opportunity." Hartley stood frozen, torn between instinct and fear. The request itself was a crime. The Gestapo had already executed one prisoner in the neighboring district for far less. His eyes turned toward the guard on duty. Private Klaus Fischer, a young man drafted from the same village. His rifle hung loose across his shoulder. He stared deliberately at the horizon, pretending to see something in the distance. He didn't need to. His silence was permission granted through deliberate blindness. The lessons began in secret, inside the barn after the day's labor. Hartley used pieces of charcoal taken from the stove and the backs of old feed sacks as paper. He taught arithmetic first, lines of numbers scrawled across rough wooden planks. The children listened intently, their eyes wide in the flickering lamplight. Outside, snow fell soundlessly over the fields, muffling every noise, as if the world itself conspired to keep their secret. Within weeks, the progress was astonishing. The eldest boy, Friedrich, only 12, began solving problems his mother could no longer understand. He worked equations in the dirt, explaining them aloud in a mixture of English and German. Hartley saw in him a spark, a raw mathematical intuition that reminded him of his brightest pupils back in Birmingham. In another world, he thought, this German child could have been his student, his protégé, perhaps even a future teacher himself. But the dangers were real. Every sound carried, every light risked discovery. Once, a patrol passed by while they were mid-lesson. The children froze, hearts pounding, while Hartley quietly wiped the slate clean with his sleeve. The guard outside paused, listened, then kept walking. Later, Fischer muttered that he'd seen nothing. Again, the blindness that saved them. The ingenuity of the prisoner teachers was boundless. With no textbooks, no pens, and no permission, they recreated a school from fragments of memory. Flight Lieutenant Robert Davies, a Welsh science instructor captured over France, taught physics using the tools of the farm. Pulleys became demonstrations of mechanical advantage. Water pumps showed hydraulic pressure. A broken wagon wheel explained centrifugal force. When the harvest came, biology returned to life in the form of seeds, growth, and the changing seasons. For the children, every moment in that hidden classroom was a revelation. They had been told that the British were crude and ignorant, that Allied prisoners were little more than beasts of labor. But here was Davies, kneeling beside them in the dust, showing them how the world worked with infinite patience. One girl later wrote, years after the war, "He made us understand things our German teachers could. He cared if we learned." The most perilous subject of all was language. Teaching English to German children could be seen as treason, as preparing them for occupation. But the children begged for it. They had heard the foreign words whispered in camp, written on scraps of newspapers, carried by radio broadcasts. They wanted to know what they meant. So at night, beneath the rustle of hay and the creak of the rafters, they practiced English phrases. Good morning. Thank you. The sun is bright. Simple words, spoken softly, carrying across the cold air like prayers of hope for a future not yet written. And in that fragile classroom, a prisoner's barn turned sanctuary, something extraordinary was happening. The enemy was being redefined not as monsters, but as human beings capable of teaching, learning, and kindness. For a few brief months, before orders shifted and the camps were moved again, that tiny farm became what war had taken from both sides: a school, a shelter, and a glimpse of peace. Somehow, the children knew that learning this forbidden language might matter someday. The air around a camp was thick with hunger, smoke, and unspoken fear. Yet in the fields, between the rhythm of scythes and the creak of wooden carts, something fragile and defiant was growing. Pilot Officer Michael Thompson of Oxford had once lectured in Latin and Greek to young scholars surrounded by ivy walls. Now, in a foreign field under the Reichsflag, his classroom was a patch of dirt between rows of wheat. His voice had softened from command to whisper. He began carefully, disguising his lessons in the rhythm of farm work. "This is wheat," he'd murmur, tapping the stalks, and the children repeated softly in English. "The cow gives milk" became a grammar exercise. The child learns quickly, a small act of rebellion. The language spread like contraband. The children took to English as though it were treasure smuggled in under their tongues. They practiced beneath their breath, traded words like marbles, whispered phrases under the roar of tractors. Their English notebooks were stitched together from stolen bureaucratic forms and ration slips. German paperwork repurposed into the tools of forbidden education. The guards learned to look away. Some out of mercy, some out of indifference. They called it child play, a harmless pastime to fill the long hours of work. But they knew. They knew what it meant to defy orders, and they pretended not to hear. When inspecting officers arrived, the air would tighten like a drum. The children hid their scraps of paper, shoving them under straw, behind wooden boards, into their sleeves. A notebook could become a death sentence. By January 1944, the snow in Mauthausen lay heavy and gray. The war had turned grim. One morning, an SS inspection team arrived without warning. The village froze. Boots struck the ground in unison, coats snapping in the wind, the metallic insignia glinting in the pale light. Inside one of the work sheds, they found 11-year-old Greta Hoffman seated on a crate, bent over a notebook. The SS officer, Hauptsturmführer Werner Krauss, seized the book and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the pages, neat columns of numbers, equations, English words written in a child's careful hand. These were not the lessons of a German school. The man's jaw tightened. "Who taught you this?" Greta's hands shook, but she did not cry. She looked toward the row of prisoners, faces she had known since harvest season. Then she lifted her chin and said, quietly but clearly, "He teaches better than anyone." Her voice trembled, then strengthened. "I want to be an engineer after the war. How can I be an engineer if no one teaches me mathematics?" For a moment, the warehouse was silent except for the wind moaning through the cracks. The local guard, Otto Richter, tried to intervene, his voice calm and deferential. "They're only passing time, Herr Hauptsturmführer," he said. "The prisoners keep the children busy while we work." But Kraus's eyes stayed fixed on the child. His sense of order, his loyalty to regulation, warred with something he could not quite name. In the end, Protocol won. Morrison, the British airman, and 2 other prisoners were taken away that same afternoon. No trial, no farewells. The children watched the truck leave, its tires cutting black scars into the snow. Then something strange began to happen. Within a week, the fields grew quiet, the laughter disappeared. The children no longer sang as they worked. Some refused to leave their homes. Others fell ill with fevers the doctor could not explain. "Psychosomatic," he whispered to the mayor. "They miss their teachers." The harvest suffered. Production dropped nearly 30%. The mayor, a pragmatic Nazi official more concerned with quotas than ideology, wrote a carefully worded letter to regional command. The prisoners' instruction of local youth appears to improve morale and agricultural efficiency. Request permission for limited educational activities under supervision. The reply came weeks later, stamped with official insignia. The language was cold, bureaucratic, but not without cracks of logic. Teaching mathematics and science was permitted. Germany needed future engineers, future builders. Teaching English, however, was forbidden. Teaching history or politics meant death. So the children adapted. They created a network of their own. The older ones who had learned from Morrison began teaching the younger ones in barns and cellars, in the shadow of the forest where patrols rarely went. They met at dusk, the air thick with the scent of straw and candle wax, reciting words they half remembered, solving problems with blunt pencils on rough wood. They carried on what he had begun, a resistance not of guns or banners, but of knowledge. And somewhere in a punishment camp hundreds of miles away, Morrison might have sensed it, the faint echo of voices in the snow, whispering English verbs into the dark, keeping his lessons alive. Hans Fieber had learned enough English from Thompson, the British prisoner, to read simple sentences, haltingly at first, like a man learning to walk again. The syllables felt foreign in his mouth, the rhythm strange, but each word was a small victory against the silence that war demanded. Hidden in the loft of an old barn, beneath hay and dust, and the faint smell of animals, he began to teach 5 other boys in secret. Their classroom was no more than a corner of the world the war had forgotten, a candle stub, a few scraps of paper, and an old English-German dictionary his grandfather had hidden since the dark years of the Weimar inflation. They whispered lessons between chores, translating the names of farm tools and crops, inventing their own Anglo-German agricultural vocabulary. Plow became Flug, seed became Samen. Rain they kept the same, because some things, Hans said, belong to everyone. They scratched words into wooden beams, rubbed them out with straw, and practiced again until the letters felt natural under their fingers. When new prisoners arrived, the children would watch from the hedgerows, eyes alert for anyone who carried himself like a teacher. They had their own secret test, mathematical puzzles drawn in chalk on the barn walls, placed just where the prisoners might see them while hauling grain or repairing fences. If one of the captives solved them, and if his manner was patient, kind, the children would find ways to approach him. Slowly, quietly, the village's youngest began to build their own underground school beneath the shadow of the Reich. Among them was a girl named Ingrid Bauer, thin, serious-eyed, always carrying a notebook sewn from scraps of old invoices. Over 2 years, she filled its pages with words and lessons from men who should have been her enemies. "Today, Mr. Collins taught us about Shakespeare," she wrote one February morning. "He remembers whole speeches. We do not know every word, but we know what it means. Romeo and Juliet are like Klaus and Anna from our village. They love, but they are forbidden because families fight." Her handwriting was uneven, but her insight was pure, the kind that war could not burn away. As the seasons changed, the tension grew. The guards were ordered to crack down on all contact between villagers and prisoners. Some officers threatened to send any lenient man to the Eastern Front, a death sentence disguised as duty. Others were offered small privileges or promotions for exposing those who disobeyed. Yet many looked the other way. The guards were fathers too, watching their own children carry themselves differently, speaking with curiosity instead of fear, learning from men they were told to despise. Private Fisher, one of the youngest guards, had always hidden his own secret. He could not read. He covered his shame with cruelty when officers were near, barking orders loudly, pretending confidence. But at night, when the camp grew silent and frost glimmered on the barbed wire, he would visit the hut where Hartley, a former London schoolteacher, was kept. There, under the dim light of a lantern, Hartley would trace words in the dirt, guiding Fisher's hand as he sounded out syllables. Slowly, the young guard began to read. By the winter of 1944, he could decipher simple German texts. A British prisoner had given him what his own country never had: literacy. The irony was not lost on him. It was the quietest act of rebellion either man could make. By February 1945, the war was a dying storm. The thunder of American artillery rolled faintly through the hills, and the villagers of Waldheim knew the end was coming. But the end, they feared, might be worse than the war itself. From the east, Soviet forces were advancing, their reputation trailing ahead like a shadow. Rumors of what they did to towns that resisted made even the bravest tremble. Some whispered that the prisoners might be the village's only protection, living proof of decency, witnesses who could tell the Allies that not everyone in Waldheim had been cruel. Then came the order. All prisoners were to be marched west immediately, away from the advancing armies. No exceptions. Everyone knew what that meant. Few would survive the journey. The air in the village turned heavy with dread. Frau Müller, whose son had been taught arithmetic by a Scottish prisoner, gathered the women in her home that night. The candles flickered, shadows stretching across the walls as she spoke. "They taught our children when we had no one else," she said softly. "Now they will be marched to death while we stand by." Around her, faces glistened in the dim light. Mothers, wives, sisters. They had lost enough. "We have a choice," she said. "Tonight, we repay what they gave." Outside, snow began to fall, muffling the world in silence. The women moved through the streets like ghosts, approaching the guards, their husbands, brothers, sons. They pleaded not with anger, but with memory. "Look away," they said, "just this once, for what they have done for our children." Feld Richter, the senior officer of the camp, stood at his post, wrestling with the heaviest decision of his life. The law was clear. Mercy was not. Yet as he looked toward the barn where his daughter once sat, reading words she had learned from a British teacher, something inside him broke. These prisoners had given his children a future beyond the Reich, and he could no longer pretend they were enemies. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere in the darkness, a gate creaked open. He had given his children a chance, a fragile thread of life beyond the ruins of the Reich. But helping them escape meant treason. It meant execution if he were caught. Still, he made his choice. That night he got drunk, deliberately, obviously. The other guards followed his lead, each one understanding the silent pact being made in that flickering barn. The doors were left unlocked. Maps were left forgotten on tables. The dogs were fed just enough to sleep. At 2 a.m, Sergeant Hartley crept through the cold corridor and woke the British prisoners. His whisper was barely a breath in the dark. The guards are drunk. The doors are open. There are maps. Some men refused to believe him. Surely it was a trap. Surely death waited outside. But Corporal Thompson looked out through the crack in the wooden wall and saw the truth. The guards were sprawled on benches, motionless. The dogs stirred, then settled again. The air was heavy with the smell of schnapps and smoke. 15 British prisoners escaped that night under a moon thin as a blade. Their footsteps were soft against the frost. They carried nothing but courage, and left something behind. Before leaving, they wrote letters for the guards' children, scrawled in careful German learned during captivity. Words became their farewell. Morrison, the schoolteacher from Birmingham, wrote to his geometry students, "Continue learning. Mathematics has no nationality. After the war, find proper teachers. Remember, knowledge is the only thing that cannot be taken from you." Thompson left his tattered English dictionary on a wooden table with a note for young Hans and his friends. "You are not enemies. You are students. Never stop learning." And Hartley, the quiet one who had once tutored the guard's son, left a letter for Friedrich, the boy with a gift for numbers. "You have a mind the world will need. Do not waste it on hate or pride. The future will need builders, not destroyers. Build something better than we did." 3 days later, the escaping men reached the American lines. Exhausted, half-starved, they reported what had happened in the small German village of Waldheim, and how its people had risked everything to let them live. The report ensured the village would be spared when the Allies arrived. But the story didn't end there. The children of Waldheim kept studying. They gathered in cellars, barns, and broken schoolrooms, using the notes and lessons the British prisoners had left behind. They built secret study circles, whispering conjugations and geometry proofs while bombs fell miles away. Even as the Reich collapsed, their pencils scratched quietly in the dark. When American forces finally entered Waldheim in April 1945, they found something extraordinary. In a classroom with shattered windows, a group of children recited Shakespeare. Others solved complex equations in chalk on a door turned sideways for a blackboard. Major James Bryant, an American education officer, stood speechless. He asked how it was possible. Ingrid Bauer, now 14, answered in slow, careful English. "British prisoners taught us. They were enemies, but became teachers. We were enemies, but became students. Learning made us human, when everything else tried to make us monsters." After the surrender, Allied investigators discovered similar stories across Germany, in barns, in farms, in prison camps now empty. Dozens of British POWs had taught German children during agricultural labor details. Over 300 captured soldiers had, in secret, chosen to educate rather than hate. Historians later estimated that thousands of German children learned to read, speak English, and think critically because of those hidden lessons. And in the ashes of war, that quiet defiance, the act of teaching, became one of the rarest victories of all. When the war ended, judgment followed. The German guards who had once watched over British prisoners now stood before tribunals. Some faced prosecution for allowing fraternization with the enemy. But amid the accusations, unexpected voices rose in their defense. Letters from former prisoners, written in careful, practiced script, spoke not of hatred, but of humanity. Captain Hartley's testimony was among them. He wrote to the occupation authorities, "Private Fisher risked his life to let us teach. He learned to read from us. He chose compassion over command. Do not punish him for being human." That letter saved Fisher's life, and it would not be the last act of kindness between enemies who had long stopped seeing each other as such. In those same hearings, the parents of German children, those who had, secretly, allowed British prisoners to teach in barns and basements, were summoned for denazification. For some interrogators, their actions were treason. For others, quiet rebellion. Frau Miller stood before the tribunal and refused to bend. Her voice, trembling yet proud, carried through the hall. "My husband died for the Reich, but my children lived because of British prisoners. They taught them to think, not just obey. That is why I helped them escape." The war had ended, but the moral reckoning had only begun. By 1946, a strange and beautiful correspondence began to ripple across the ruins of Europe. British prisoners who had escaped or been repatriated began writing back to the villages where they had once been held. They asked after the children. Are they safe? Are they studying still? And to their astonishment, letters came back. The children replied. In English. They had continued their lessons long after the camps were gone. Their handwriting was awkward, their grammar imperfect, but their pride was unmistakable. Friedrich, the quiet boy who once solved geometry problems with a stick and barn dust, wrote to Captain Hartley. "I am studying engineering now at technical school. The Americans are helping rebuild our town. I remember your lessons every day. You said, build something better. I will." Another letter arrived for Sergeant Thompson from Hans Weber, now a tall, serious young man. "We still meet to read English. We have real books now. Just finished Oliver Twist. Now we understand why you said education defeats tyranny." In 1955, 10 years after the war's end, an extraordinary reunion took place. Former British POWs returned to the same German villages that had once held them behind wire. When Morrison, the makeshift professor, stepped into Mühlhausen, he stopped in disbelief. A banner stretched across the square. "Welcome back, Herr Professor Morrison." His former students, now young adults, had prepared a presentation in his honor. They solved geometry problems on a blackboard, the same ones he had once traced in dust and straw 12 years earlier. Among them stood Greta Hoffmann. Once a frightened teenager who dreamed of becoming an engineer, she now wore the uniform of one. Tears filled her eyes as she embraced him. "You gave me my life," she whispered in perfect English. In Munich, Thompson found Hans Weber again, now an English teacher at a local gymnasium. His students performed scenes from Shakespeare, the very passages Thompson had once recited from memory in the shadows of barns, hiding from guards. The cycle had completed itself. The prisoner had taught the child. The child had become the teacher. But the most poignant moment came when Captain Hartley found Private Fisher, the guard who had once risked everything to let the teaching continue. Fisher was no longer a soldier. He was a teacher, too. He stood in front of a classroom of German children and told them about the British prisoners who had defied orders to teach the enemy's children. "I tell them," Fisher said softly, "that learning has no uniform. Teaching has no nationality. In the darkest times, our enemies became our teachers, and our teachers became our hope." Years passed. The children became adults, engineers, translators, professors, and builders of the new Germany. A British government investigation in 1960 discovered something remarkable. The villages where British POWs had taught during the war showed higher rates of democratic participation, lower rates of extremism, and stronger economic recovery. The report's conclusion was understated but profound. Through simple acts of teaching, these prisoners may have done more to denazify Germany than any official program. They had shown a generation of German children that their supposed enemies were human, compassionate, intelligent, and kind. And that lesson endured far longer than any propaganda. The last surviving prisoner teacher, Michael Thompson, died in 2003 at the age of 95. His obituary in the Times mentioned his wartime captivity only briefly, but in a small German village, the news made front-page headlines. The headline read, "The English Teacher Who Gave Us Back Our Future." At his memorial service in Waldenheim, hundreds of Germans gathered. Among them was Friedrich Weber, now a retired engineering professor with silver hair and kind eyes. He took the podium and said, "He came as a prisoner, but he left as our teacher. He and others like him taught us when our own nation had abandoned our education to war. They risked punishment to give us knowledge. They showed us that humanity transcends conflict. Every German child who learned from them carries that lesson forward. Education survives war. Knowledge defeats hatred. And sometimes your greatest teachers come wearing enemy uniforms." Today, a small bronze plaque stands on the wall of Mühlhausen's school. Its inscription reads, "In memory of the British prisoners of war who taught our children during the darkest days. They were captives who chose to teach, enemies who chose to nurture, men who chose humanity over hatred. The children they taught are grandparents now. Yet they still remember the English phrases, the geometry problems, the Shakespeare verses, whispered once in secret by exhausted men in tattered uniforms who saw not enemies, but children hungry to learn. Because in the end, that is what true teachers do. They teach, not for politics, not for power, but because the human mind must never stop growing. And somewhere in the memory of Europe's darkest years, there remains an image. A prisoner crouched in a barn, drawing a triangle in the dirt. A group of children watching with wide eyes, the faint light of dawn spilling through the cracks in the wall. Some victories are not won on battlefields. Some are won in barns, with sticks and dust, and the courage to believe that knowledge is the only true liberation. And some prisoners, even behind barbed wire, were never truly captive, because a teacher with willing students is always free.